Welcome to this presentation hosted by the International Center for Moral Injury here at Durham University. Our topic tonight is moral injury and church-related abuse, responding creatively through the visual arts, music, and poetry. As with much work on moral injury, this presentation does deal with a difficult topic. If you're affected by any of the issues discussed, please do see the video description for sources of support. We're honored to introduce our speakers for this evening, Maggi Creese, who is the lead officer of Chaplaincy to Survivors in the Diocese of Newcastle, and who brought together our other three speakers, each a survivor of church-related abuse. Sarah Troughton, an NHS psychiatrist, David Creese, a visiting fellow in classics at Newcastle University, and Peter Locke, an organist and composer. And I turn things over to them.
A couple of years ago, our diocese launched a set of resources called If I Told You, What Would You Do? These resources, created by Sarah and David, combine the principles of trauma-informed care with Christian theology and the voices of those with lived experience of trauma caused in and by the church. Their aim is to engage with survivors and to help others in the church know how to respond well to them and build confidence in their ability to do so. Around the time of the launch of those resources, one of our clergy colleagues expressed the hope that we would be able to keep this conversation going, and he wondered if we might do something related to the Stations of the Cross. This suggestion came at a time when I was educating myself about moral injury, and when I was starting to have conversations with colleagues about the need to educate others in the church about it, and to find ways to address the moral dissonance, distress, and injury experienced by victims and survivors of church-related abuse, and by others in the church as well. It was also around that time that I was getting to know Peter, and we invited him to join Sarah and David in thinking about how they might engage creatively with the Stations of the Cross. The Gospel Passion narratives lend themselves to an exploration of moral injury in the context of church-related abuse, and they already represent commonly held stories that provide the contents for communal, performative rituals during Holy Week. Participants may take part in a passion play, reenacting the events that led up to the crucifixion, or they may walk the way of the cross on Good Friday, using the Stations of the Cross to follow the path from Pilate's house, where Jesus was condemned to death, to Calvary, where he was crucified, and engage actively with Jesus' suffering. In his book, The Body of Jesus and Sexual Abuse, Michael Trainer presents the passion narratives as stories of abuse, including abuse of power by religious authorities. Two priests in the United States, Paul Turner and Ronald Patrick Robb, have published a Stations of the Cross liturgy in which they invite the church to contemplate the passion of Jesus through the experience of survivors of clerical abuse. While these efforts to encourage members of the church and its leaders to empathize with survivors are very welcome, they are clergy-led, and they are examples of the church speaking to and on behalf of victims and survivors. In bringing together Sarah, David, and Peter, all of whom have lived experience of abuse in a church context, the question that emerged was this: what happens when survivors of church-related abuse use the Stations of the Cross as a means to speak both to their fellow survivors and to those who let them down in the communities where they were harmed? Our answer is a creative project called Jagged Edges. Jagged Edges combines a theoretical and clinical understanding of moral injury with Christian theology and the voices of those with lived experience of the moral injury that can be sustained alongside the trauma of abuse. Each survivor has approached the passion narratives from her or his own perspective and through a different artistic medium to co-create their own Stations of the Cross. These stations draw meaningful connections between the shared narrative of Jesus' passion and the lived experience of individuals harmed in Christian churches. Next April, we will put on an exhibition of the complete set of stations at Shieldfield Artworks in Newcastle, and then at Newcastle Cathedral. We also plan to publish the set of stations next year, and will make it available for use in Christian communities where abuse has taken place. We think of these stations as a framework that people might use to develop things like Lent courses and Bible studies, or rituals and liturgies of lament, healing, and reconciliation. The title, Jagged Edges, reflects the unique elements of survivors' individual experiences of moral injury, which, like the Passion narratives, overlap but do not fit neatly together. It reflects the dissonant combination of God's love and the harm done in and by God's church in those experiences. And it reflects the fact that survivors often engage with the church from the periphery, because that is where they feel safe. What we would like to do with the rest of our time this evening is to share Sarah, David, and Peter's creative responses to 4 episodes in the Gospel Passion narratives. We have chosen these episodes because we think they do a good job of demonstrating elements of the experience of moral injury in the context of church-related abuse that churches might want to engage with in order to address those injuries in their communities. The entire set of stations could be approached in the way that the traditional stations are followed in Good Friday liturgies. That is to say, in the order in which the episodes occur in Scripture. But there are, we think, many ways in which one might engage with this material. In an exhibit of all of the stations, one might engage only with the 1 or 2 stations that resonate and feel safe and accessible, for example. Nor would they necessarily need to be taken in the order in which they appear in the story. What we have done here is identify stations that can be paired with each other. They are, in the first pair, the moment in Luke's Gospel when Jesus asks God to forgive his abusers, and the scene in Matthew's Gospel where Pilate asks the crowd what they want him to do with Jesus, and the scene that follows in which Jesus is beaten and mocked by Pilate's soldiers. And in the second pair, Peter's denial of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, and Peter's encounter with Jesus on the beach after the resurrection in John's Gospel. We will pause when each image first appears, so as to give you a moment to look before one of us begins speaking. In this image, Sarah is engaging with something which is common in the experiences of many survivors. That is, the experience of being encouraged or told or even pressured to forgive their abusers. This pressure to forgive can increase the sense of guilt felt by the survivor and the shame that they are made to feel by those calling for them to forgive when they are overwhelmed by the paralyzing impact of what has happened, can isolate survivors and lead to further injury with potentially devastating consequences. It may also contribute to the survivor's feeling of being betrayed by those who should care for them, and perhaps even betrayed by their faith. One of the things that is often observed by way of helping survivors get their head around forgiveness in this context is the fact that in this moment in Luke's Gospel, Jesus doesn't make a declaration of personal forgiveness. He doesn't say, "I forgive them." Instead, he calls upon God the Father to forgive them. This can help survivors recognize that they don't need to take personal responsibility for the forgiveness of those who have harmed them. Now I'm going to play a recording of the poem that David has written in response to this episode. David happens to be a Hellenist, and when he came to the Passion narratives, he went back to the Greek New Testament. As he read, he found that particular words or phrases resonated with him and his experiences, and he wrote his poems as a response to these bits of Greek text.
Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Pater aphes autois, ugar oidas in ti poiusin. Luke 23:34. Father, how can you forgive them? They know exactly what they are doing. They have done it before. They will do it again. And each time they will say, it was a mistake, a one-off, a special case, a misunderstanding, a terrible blunder, a little thing blown completely out of proportion. Father, how can you forgive them? They do it to wound. They do it to crush. They do it to teach me my place. They do it to protect themselves, their friends, their jobs, their reputations, their grasp of a universe where all is light. Father, how can you forgive them? They say they never did it. They say I was difficult. They say I asked for it. They say I had it coming to me. They say, do I realize the seriousness of the allegations I am making? They say, do I really want to ruin an illustrious career? They say, I will only harm myself. They say they are the victims. They say I am crucifying them. They say, who do you think you are? I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Make straight the way of the Lord. I am a reed shaken by the wind. Father, how can you forgive them? They are trapped in themselves. They do not know how to repent. Aphes. Forgive, let go, set free.
Now we jump back to the episode in Matthew's Gospel where Jesus is condemned to death. Before Sarah talks to you about this image, we're going to hear another poem written by David in response to the scene that follows this one, in which Jesus is beaten and mocked by Pilate's soldiers.
And a reed in his right hand, kai kalamon en te dexia autu. Matthew 27:29. What is it? A reed, a flute, a staff, a pen, a yardstick, an arrow, a fishing rod. You hold it because they place it in your palm, the oldest reflex. What is it? It is agency, it is dignity, it is voice, it is honor, it is truth, it is music, it is proportion, it is the force of attraction. They genuflect, and it is none of that. It is a whippy stick to smack the thorns in deeper. It is the splintered reed that wounds the hand that leans on it. It is their saliva on your sternum because the cloak doesn't cover you. It is the party hat that pierces the scalp. It is the new clothes that expose you before all their eyes. It is none of the things they tell you it is. It is hashtag you too, hashtag you too, hashtag you too. And between the blows that echo across the church hall, I message you back. A bruised reed he will not break. A bruised reed he will not break. A bruised reed he will not break. Kalamos, reed. Also staff, flute, shaft of an arrow, measuring rod, pen, fishing rod.
In the moment when Jesus is bearing the sins of the world, he calls out, "Forgive them." We're taken back to the words of the crowd, "Crucify him," and his response is, "Forgive them." These two scenes respond directly to each other. In this scene, we are firstly drawn to Jesus. Jesus stands here in the pain of his wounds and of humiliation, mocked and exposed in front of a hostile crowd. We note that in the main, except to respond to one accusation, Jesus is silent throughout this ordeal. Those bearing the experience of church-related abuse often remain silent because although they are innocent, they bear the burden of shame and humiliation. The fear of this being exposed is used by their abuser to silence them. They have also often been silenced by the church, a very deep betrayal. which can feel like having been betrayed by their faith and even God himself. Jesus stands silently accused of blasphemy. Victims of church-related abuse are often told by their abusers that they are the ones going against God. This is the message they also get from others around them in the church in less overt ways that may be unintentional. Through disbelief or the misuse of scripture, they are falsely accused of violating their values and faith and carry this burden. Jesus, though surrounded by people, is alone in this scene. His disciples have fled, and we can't identify those in the crowd who may be there to support him among those who are hostile. When we have been harmed by poor responses to abuse in the church, we feel cut off from that which should be our refuge and strength, our community, our faith, our God. Now we turn to Pilate. The presence of Jesus is a challenge to the authority of Pilate, and in him we can see how those in leadership positions might experience moral injury. He has already been betrayed by his own hierarchy. Herod, the king of Judea, appointed by the Romans, has passed responsibility for this case down to Pilate, aware of the potential political fallout. Pilate is forced into a situation where there is no easy resolution, and this is often where moral injury in leadership occurs. We know that when church-related abuse is uncovered, this can rock the authority of church leaders. They may feel guilty that they failed to prevent the abuse. They may feel shocked that those entrusted with power have let them down. They may fear that an acknowledgement of the abuse could undermine their authority or result in suspicion being directed at them. They may feel morally injured or respond in ways which subsequently create a moral injury, for example, with denial or by failing to conduct a proper investigation or by alienating the victim. Pilate acknowledges that Jesus has no case to answer, but he is also aware of the consequences if he doesn't convict. His own authority would be undermined. There could be riots, and the Roman domination of these lands might be threatened. Leaders in the church can feel under threat if they do the right thing in response to abuse for a variety of reasons. Fear of how leadership will be perceived by those above them, fear that they will be blamed, anxiety about what others in the church and in the wider society will think about them and the institution of the church, fear of the consequences within the church community. This can lead to poor responses amongst church leaders, not through malice, but because of their own moral injury. Whatever Pilate does, there will be negative consequences. How can he come through this unscathed? He can't, but he tries. He symbolically washes his hands of responsibility, although we know that no amount of water will absolve him. Church leaders may attempt to absolve themselves of the responsibility for abuse that happens in their churches, but they can't, however much they try. They hold authority and are responsible for the church's response. It is only when they acknowledge this that they can address their own injury and respond to those directly affected in a meaningful way. Another way in which Pilate attempts to absolve himself of the responsibility for the decision is to put the blame on the crowd, whose response he fears. We sometimes see this in the actions of church leaders who may fear how their admissions or decisions will be perceived by their congregations, the wider church and society. They may use their assumptions about what their congregation and community might think or do as an excuse for inadequate or harmful action in response to abuse. Even though he delegates the decision to the crowd, Pilate stands somewhat reluctantly in authority over the trial, which leads to the conviction of Jesus, putting to death a man he believes to be innocent, and this creates a deep moral injury. Now we turn to the crowd. Who is in the crowd? There may be some who just can't believe that the leaders could be wrong. This is reflected in what we so often hear in churches when abuse is mentioned, that it couldn't happen here. There may be some who want to believe that they were right to put their faith in the authorities because they are invested in the status quo. Where abuse in the church has happened, there may be some in the congregation who just want things to stay the same and who fear what will happen to the stability that they have known if status quo is challenged. It may be too painful to acknowledge that those you trusted did the wrong thing. Likewise, there may be some in the congregations who just don't want to accept that they were wrong to put their trust in the abuser because of the consequences if this turns out to be true. This may be the abuser's relatives or others who have put their faith in the abuser directly. It may shatter everything they thought to be true, and the psychic fallout of this may be too great to accept. All of these may be inclined to believe the misinformation spread by another group, those who don't want Jesus to be found innocent, because they are invested in Jesus being wrong. In the context of church-related abuse, this may be the abuser. In the context of church-related abuse, this may be the abuser or others who are invested in keeping the abuse hidden, those who have actively facilitated or gained from it. They may spread lies in order to discredit the abused, as some in the crowd fuels false rumours amongst the rest so as to manipulate opinion. These people often have the loudest voices, perhaps because of power, authority, or respect that their voices command. Then there are those who believe the innocence of Jesus but won't speak up, or who stay silent because of fear of the consequences if they go against the majority. There may be also those who stand up for what they believe but can't be heard in the face of the crowd baying for Jesus' life to be taken. Again, there are many parallels in the context of church-related abuse. There are those who were suspicious but didn't speak up because they feared that no one would believe them. Those who thought they must be wrong because others around them were witnessing the same things but doing nothing, and those who just did not know what to do. But being a bystander does not protect you from moral injury. It is only when we accept that as members of the church we share in the responsibility for the harm done to the abused, as the members of the crowd were complicit in Jesus' death, that we can heal from our own moral injury at being part of a community that has hurt those who put their trust in it, and improve our own responses to such abuse. In this image, we see Peter soon after he has disowned Jesus. The darkness of the right side of the image is where the betrayal has taken place. We know that earlier in the story, when surrounded by others of the same values and beliefs, Peter had been prepared to fight for Jesus, but they have now fled, and he is left to stay as close to Jesus as he can. He feels cold, alone, and frightened. He seeks comfort by the fire. The cost of this is to be challenged. Due to a combination of fear and weakness, he denies Jesus. In his vulnerable state, he did not live up to his values and beliefs. He has tried to do the right thing, but still failed. In the larger part of the image, we see the consequences of this denial. We see his emotions exposed. He is wrought with guilt, shame, self-condemnation, and disgust in his actions. He may be wondering what makes his actions different to those of Judas. He is morally injured by not staying true to his values and beliefs. So what does this mean for us today, contemplating the impact of church-related abuse? Firstly, thinking about the impact of the betrayal that has happened in the darkness of the image. Those of us who have been abused in the church have been let down or betrayed by those who should have been expected to stand up for us. For example, by those who allowed the abusers access to us rather than challenge them when they had doubts. Those who dismissed the signs that abuse was occurring, and those who diminished or denied the abuse when told. This itself is a further injury to those already directly affected by abuse. The moral injury of betrayal adds to an already deeply held feelings of shame, self-condemnation, guilt, and isolation. And we know that all this can lead to serious social, psychological, and spiritual consequences, including isolation from their faith and support networks. Secondly, what does Peter's experience say to those in the church where abuse has happened? We would like to think that we would do the right thing under pressure, but would we? Like Peter, other church members may feel that they should have stood up and fought to prevent it, or done more than they did. Then, when challenged, they fear what people might think or do, or feel vulnerable because of the circumstances that they are in. Just like Peter, these are not bad people with bad morals or beliefs. In fact, they are probably trying to do the right thing, but when challenged in a moment of weakness, doubt, uncertainty, or fear, they don't stand up. I myself have had experience of good people denying memory of what has happened when they were called upon to do so. But why? They may, on reflection, have felt complicit by their own past limited actions, inaction, or unintentional facilitation of the abuse. Like Peter, they may feel the shame of not having done more to prevent what had happened. He had fallen asleep in the garden instead of praying. He had not realized Judas's intentions, for example. And then, like Peter in his denial of Jesus, they fear the consequences of standing up when called upon or challenged, especially when they feel their views may not be those of others around them. Like Peter, they are dealing with their own experience of the trauma that has happened, and they're also their own moral dissonance or injury, with its significant emotional, psychological, and ethical consequences, as we can see in the main part of the image. Because of this, their responses are further negatively impacted. The shame and guilt that comes with this can actually perpetuate the poor responses by individuals and the church itself. And it is only when we acknowledge this that our responses as both individuals and the church can improve and heal. If we jump forward from this image to the story on the beach where the healing occurs in Peter's case, feeling unworthy and shameful, Peter has to face Jesus directly, alone, several times in deeply personal and symbolic reconciliation. Symbolism and ritual having a particular role in the healing from moral injury. In this, Jesus navigates the meaning of what has happened, symbolically speaking and responding 3 times. In asking, "Do you love me?" Jesus directly addresses the shame that Peter is feeling and restores his relationship with Jesus and leads him to greatest purpose and mission. He doesn't just reinstate Peter, he gives him a greater meaning and purpose and honors him, as if by going through these traumatic experiences and moral injury from his own actions, he experiences post-traumatic growth. We know that finding the meaning in trauma is often essential for the healing of moral injury. For those who experience the direct or indirect trauma of church-related abuse, we can be healed and go on, not just to have meaning or purpose, but a greater meaning and purpose than that which we have had before. But it is only by being valued and honoured, as Jesus displays to Peter, that this can happen. This is a lesson for our leaders, churches and communities in the healing, acceptance and honour of those who have been hurt or harmed, whether directly or indirectly, by such abuse.
When I was asked to provide a piece of music for the project, Jagged Edges, I wasn't sure. Composing, well, I've been a performer for many years, a liturgical performer. Composing has been rather more recent. It took off during lockdown. And in a way, it's been a struggle as I'm trying to find a personal voice, as well as still working on the techniques. So it's been a great privilege and a blessing to be asked to contribute in this way. Of course, when asked to provide a musical commentary on one of the pictures, Sarah's pictures, I thought, well, they're great pictures. Then I found myself unable to think of anything, indecision. And then suddenly it just came. Intersections, this idea of crossroads. They were a real crossroads with traffic, pedestrians, can be a place of danger, be a place of disorientation. When it's happened with me, I've been at the crossroads facing a very, very tricky decision. Then there's been the crossroads of not knowing which way to turn. Should I do that which I'm being invited to do, but which somehow I feel not to be correct? Or to turn away and take perhaps a more difficult path, to say no. What happens in intersections is it's a piece of counterpoint. That means there's 4 lines of music written for strings. By the way, the electronic sounds, that's another idea. They come in later to create ambience. And I can discuss that with anyone later. We have the idea of a single line. When 2 single lines cross, they may create something harmonious, like a chord, C major or C minor, or if they're very close together, create dissonance. Now, of course, in music, dissonance is very important. It's the agent of expression. It's essential to the harmonic cycle, which in turn produces rhythm. But dissonance can also have an emotional effect of perhaps unsettling the listener or making the listener question. So there's the musical dissonance with a theoretical dissonance is also related to the greater, more wider perception of dissonance of doing something when we do something, or when I do something, or done something, or been seduced into something that actually I feel is wrong, is against my better judgment. This in turn creates trauma. So Intersections is a kind of short picture, a tapestry of the interweaving lines, and explores, if you like, or evokes, it's an attempt to evoke the tenuous grip of self-identity amid conflicts in perception, or even the sense of reality, or the sense of right and wrong. Perhaps it asks a question. It hurt. I blame myself. I could have walked another way.
In her book, Trauma and Grace, Serena Jones describes the way 4 victims of domestic abuse responded to the dramatic reenactment of the Passion narrative in a Maundy Thursday liturgy held in the church where they attended a women's self-defense class. One of them said afterward, "He gets me. He knows." As Jones eloquently puts it, the mirrored cross reflects our own stories of suffering back. Some survivors of church-based abuse, whether they still retain a sense of faith or not, have similarly seen in the story of Christ's Passion a reflection of the harm and betrayal they themselves have suffered. Their involvement in the church has made them, against their own will, co-sufferers with Christ. The challenge of repair from moral injury within a Christian community can be felt as the dissonance between the experience of this Christ-like suffering and a church which has continued in various ways to deny them. As Sarah pointed out, there is moral injury on both sides. The most meaningful repair will thus be mutual and reciprocal. If it is to be more than a transient gesture, it will require sustained efforts of time and attention from both sides. It will require a liminal space where both sides can feel safe enough to hear the other. It will always be incipient, incomplete, and imperfect. We are going to conclude our talk by considering the challenges inherent in a creative framework for repair through one final episode, which occurs near the end of John's Gospel. Peter, whose moral injury occurred in the interval between fishing and fishing, goes back to what he knew before he knew Jesus. 6 of the disciples join him. They fish all night and catch nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus, initially unrecognized by the disciples in the boat, appears on the beach and tells them to cast their net over the other side. Suddenly, there are so many fish that they struggle to land their catch. Alerted by one of his companions that it is Jesus, Peter springs into the sea and swims ashore. The others follow in the boat. In a conversation following their breakfast on the beach, Jesus addresses Peter by the name he went by before Jesus named him Peter. He asks Peter 3 times, once for each of Peter's denials, whether Peter loves him. Can this episode provide a context within which to frame an attempt at repair through ritual? What happens when survivors of church-based abuse consider this scene together with this possibility in view? What do they notice? Among other things, we notice 3 things in particular: distance, time, and vocabulary. Distance. The boat is not far from the land, close enough for a brief conversation about the fishing, but still a distance to swim. 200 cubits, about 90 meters, which is roughly 2 lengths of an Olympic swimming pool. Time. It will have taken a few minutes for Peter to reach the shore. The boat, now heavily laden with fish and 1 man down, takes longer to arrive. We notice the brief interval during which Peter is alone with Jesus on the beach. Implicit in the detail of the precise number of fish caught is the time required to count them. Similarly, the time it takes to follow Jesus' instruction to bring some of the fish they have just caught, and presumably to clean and cook them on the charcoal fire he has lit, and the time during which they all eat the food together. Moral repair takes time. Time spent together, time not just in community, but in communal activity. Vocabulary. There are several words for love in ancient Greek, the language in which the New Testament was written. 2 of them occur in this passage. The more common of the 2, the one Peter uses, is phileo. This is the word most often associated with the spontaneous, emotional love we feel toward our dearest family members and our closest friends. The same verb can also mean kiss. Thus, it indicates fondness and affection and the outward expression of these feelings toward a loved one. The word Jesus favors, agapao, is on the other hand comparatively rare in ancient Greek. It often signifies a kind of love based on respect, esteem, goodwill, and sometimes also delight or even affection arising from these. In some contexts, these 2 words for love, or their cognates, seem to be used interchangeably, and most modern translations make no distinction between the 2 in this passage. But the difference was clearly felt by earlier readers of John's Gospel, since the Latin version of the Bible, the Vulgate, preserves the distinction by means of 2 verbs, amo and diligo, whose semantic ranges closely parallel those of the Greek original. So we too, like many other readers before us, have tried to sense this difference in our engagement with the passage, and to gauge its weight in a moment of partial repair following devastating moral injury. When we pay attention to the vocabulary, we notice that Jesus asks one question and Peter answers another. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, agapasme more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I philose." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, agapasme." He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I philose." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, philesme." Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, philesme. And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I philose." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." It is a hard question. Not just, do you love me, but agapasme. It is the question which often lies hidden at the heart of survivors' many forms of engagement with the churches in which they were harmed. Do you respect me? Do you hold me in esteem? Can you show me goodwill? Can you delight in my recovery? Do you value me, whether or not there is the opportunity or inclination for affection to grow between us? Sometimes the answers, even when heartfelt, do not precisely match the terms of the questions. Often it is survivors who find that we must modify our vocabulary to meet a church where it is and converse with it in the language it is capable of at this moment. We notice that we must sometimes accept an imperfect repair as a beginning. But in doing this work, we hope to help to create a space for such a beginning. Our Stations of the Cross are an attempt to offer others in the church a liminal space, as though between land and sea, in which to hear and respond to what is for us the central challenge of repairing the moral injuries caused by church-based abuse.
Do you love me? Agapasme. John 21:16. At daybreak you come up empty, still at sea. So I show you 153 ways to say it, but they swim behind your back and you don't see them. You're leaning over the other side of the nave, trying to make out the spot where you nearly sank, that time when you thought too hard about sinking. Later, when the bones lie on the sand, we watch the coals sink, and I ask you again. And now, as the sun catches your hair almost dry, I know your answer is almost yes. And I say, you know you will be me one day.
And now we'll address the olive tree in the room. This is the image we use to promote our event today, but why do we use it? In Zachary Moon's summing up of the recent ICMI conference, he presented an image of a Palestinian olive tree, scarred, twisted, knotted and ugly. Yet I thought it was quite beautiful. It was surviving despite its harsh environment, a representation of survival from moral injury. And I identified with this image. I identified with its sense of survival, but not just survival, its fruitfulness and its thriving.
Things that happen leave imprints. I found myself thinking, somehow everything that happened is somehow connected. Bad things that seemed good at the time but weren't. Friendships brokered, then betrayed. Hopes raised and then dashed. The mental traffic flow of memories, people, faces, places, events. From all this is spun the tapestry that is both kaleidoscopic and shape-shifting. These thoughts were prompted by that picture of the olive tree. Something as though a monochrome image seemed to come alive. Have you ever looked at a familiar face and suddenly found the person behind it is different, somehow distant? Or is the face, as a matter of fact, that of a person you don't know at all, as a matter of fact? Have you ever found yourself suddenly frozen in time and space, unsure of your location or of who you are? Have you experienced such dislocation? Yet there is something that connects. The three sections which form the triptych, altered state of time and place, explore the at times fragile connections between the things that happen, the things that have happened, and perhaps the things that are to happen. and how my mind is processing these, always organically growing, rather like that olive tree, with always that need to connect one event in a place and time to another event in a place and time. I wanted a completely different musical tapestry to Intersections. I thought that something along the lines of jazz rock fusion or progressive rock. Then I thought of the idea of the triptych, the central section of which I suppose is characteristic of a church musician, rather like a chorale, a hymn tune, but a very strange hymn tune with an electronically realized voice singing a ghostly vocal line. Around this group, the introduction, rather unsettling, rather like that point where you stand frozen and something suddenly hits you, a memory, something you can't quite grasp. Then after the chorale, there's an epilogue with cozier sounds, a flute arabesque, but asking a question or carrying a warning. Things are not always what they seem. I suppose for the traumatized spirit, the traumatized mind can often feel the sense of dislocation. I'm broken. Perhaps I'm healing. Let's see.
Thank you. If you'd like to check out the If I Told You What Would You Do resources, there's the link there, and these QR codes go to these sites. So there's that, and then the Chaplaincy to Survivors, if you're interested in finding out more about that and the work that we do, there's a link to that. And then that's my email address at the bottom in case anyone wants to get in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maggie, Peter, David, and Sarah, for your wonderful talents and for bringing this and sharing them with us this evening.